Hello and welcome to this episode of The Psychology of Almost Everything. My name is Peter Thompson.
My name is Stewart Grant.
Today I'm delighted to welcome Roy Ledingham, who for 20 years worked as a DCI in public protection. Roy, welcome. First question from Stewart.
Roy, I think a lot of your work in public protection was in the organisation called MAPPA. So I wonder if you could just tell us what MAPPA is and how it works.
I certainly can. So MAPPA stands for the Multi-Agency Public Protection Arrangements, and it was statutory made by the Criminal Justice Act in 2003. Now, I would like to go into the history of how MAPPA came about, if that would be okay.
Oh, please do.
So in the 1990s, there were a series of horrendous incidents. If I go back to a murder that happened on Wimbledon Common, a lady called Rachel Nickel got savagely stabbed over 40 times in front of her small child that was in the park with her. And it obviously made headlines, and the Metropolitan Police botched the whole investigation. The News of the World at that time was a very powerful paper, as was The Sun. And in those days, papers could carry massive public response by what they published. Rachel Nickel's killer wasn't caught for many years, and the Metropolitan Police arrested somebody by the name of Colin Stagg. The lead detectives on that case were obsessed that he had committed the offence. I was a uniformed police officer in the Metropolitan Police at that time, and I was on the periphery in that I was involved in the search at Wimbledon Common. So I know a little bit about the investigation. The Metropolitan Police didn't come out covered in glory, and transpired that DNA evidence a number of years later, well into the 2000s, transpired that somebody called Robert Napper was responsible for Rachel's death. When he was caught, he was in prison for the murder of two other and the attempted murder of somebody else. So that's how they found that he had done that. But he was a serial killer and will spend the rest of his life in one of the secure hospitals. Just following that incident, Fred and Rosemary West came to light. Fred was responsible for the killing of at least 12. His wife Rosemary West, assisted in hiding the bodies. The papers grabbed onto this, as with any murder, and the public became alarmed. There was a perception that people weren't safe in the country. And it got to a point in the late 90s when there were other incidents, I'm not going to go into them all, in the late 90s that there was a decision made. It was the end of the Thatcher era. Tony Blair started his government, 10 years in government, in about 1997. They realised they were going to have to do something about it. So they made an enactment in the 1997 Sex Offenders Act, where people convicted of some sexual offences had to register. So they had to let police know where they were, basically. And in 1997, that's all people had to do.
So if a sexual offender had to register,
Yeah.
would he then have to register for the rest of his life?
No, they don't. The 1997 Act made sex offenders convicted of sexual offences have to notify for a certain period of time. However, it wasn't policed, and at that time it didn't really work. And then if we go on to 2000, there's a wee girl called Sarah Payne, and she was murdered by a guy called Roy Whiting. He abducted her, sexually assaulted her, and News of the World got right onto it. And I've met Sarah's mum on several occasions. I sat on government committee that it introduced the Child Sex Offender Disclosure Scheme. His mum, Sarah Payne, her name was, sadly is dead now, but she was a very powerful, driven woman, and she was solely responsible really to get the Home Office to get this Child Sex Offender Disclosure Scheme up and running. And so that was in 2000. Shortly after that, another girl in the home counties was abducted. Her name was Millie Dowler. The investigation took a long time to find her body, which they did some weeks after she went missing. and a long time to solve the murder. The murder remained unsolved for many years. A guy called Levi Belfield was responsible for her abduction and killing. He had previously murdered a number of young women in similar circumstances and was in custody when that was discovered. The sad thing about it is that Millie's death came at quite a time before he was able to murder the other people. So had a better investigation ensued, then perhaps these girls would still be alive. However, that's not the case. At a similar time to Millie's death, there were two girls in a small place called Soham in Cambridgeshire, Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman, and they were murdered by a school caretaker called Ian Huntley. Please bear in mind that all these things are coming on top of each other, and the papers are going on that the government aren't doing enough to protect. And it was at a point that Tony Blair's government was in danger of being taken down by the public pressure and to do something. To cut a very long story-ish, they got a very senior police officer, the head of the National Probation Service in England and Wales, and the head of the prison service in England and Wales, and they said, you get together and you find some way of protecting people from convicted sexual offenders. And they came up with something that is...
Roy, can I just check? By implication, all those men that you've mentioned, those perpetrators, were they all convicted of other offences, or were some of them first-time offenders?
Ian Huntley had been arrested in Lincolnshire in Humberside on many occasions, but he'd never been convicted. 3 women had alleged that he'd raped them. For some reason, they never got to trial. But he was well known in police circles, and information regarding his previous alleged offending never got to the school where he worked. If it had, I doubt very much whether he would have been given a position in a school where he was a caretaker. But he had never been convicted of a sexual offence. He had been convicted of burglary before, but not of sexual offending.
What you're talking about here is risk assessment, aren't you?
Information sharing and work to prevent perpetrators having the possible...
So you say, there was very senior police, head of the probation service and the head of the prison service, told to go away
and come up with something.
That was the origin of MAPPA.
That they came up with, working with civil servants, they came up with something that I'm really proud to have been involved with, because it works. It absolutely works. How our offender management, how we go about our offender management, and it really is something excellent. So the multi-agency public protection arrangements, and I'm going to refer to that as MAPPA from now on. In England and Wales, there are 43 police areas, and MAPPA goes along with these police areas. So every police area has its own dedicated MAPPA, except the City of London Police that is taken in by the Metropolitan Police. The City of London is like a square mile, so it doesn't have its own MAPPA area. The Metropolitan Police take that. Every MAPPA area has a strategic management board, and it'll either be a very senior probation officer or a very senior police officer. Right, the MAPPA duty to cooperate agencies, I'll just list a few of them, but it's not exclusive to these particular agencies. There's the National Health Service and mental health services. There's adult and children's social care, who are absolutely vital, have loads and loads of information on families, and it's very interesting and important to the MAPPA process. The Department of Work and Pensions are part of the legislation, and their role is to make sure that sexual offenders don't get placed into employment that is unsuitable for them. They are vital that they come along and are part of the information sharing process, which is what MAPPA is really about. It's about sharing information. The Department of Education is part of that. And another very important service is the housing and accommodating offenders. when they come out of prison. Convicted offenders coming out of prison, if they haven't got suitable accommodation, they can spiral out of control very quickly and reoffend. So that is vital. Now, I would like to go into how MAPPA works. Firstly, it's a case of identifying who it comes under the MAPPA management. There are 4 categories of offenders. Sexual offenders being category 1. So people convicted of nearly every sexual offence will be subject to MAPPA. How long they will be subject to MAPPA depends on what sentence they are given at court. So anybody who is sentenced to 2.5 years or more for committing a sexual offence will be on lifetime notification requirements. So they will be on the sex offender register for the rest of their life unless they have a successful appeal. And they can only appeal to come off the sexual offence register after 15 years in the community. Once they come out of prison, 15 years have to go by before they can even appeal to come off the register. Some people get a 10-year period notification requirement, so they have to tell the police where they are and various other things. So it depends what sentence they've got. It determines how long they're going to be on the register for. Category 2 of MAPPA are for violent offenders. Now, when somebody commits a violent offence and they are sentenced to 1 year or more, then they will become MAPPA eligible for as long as they are on licence. Most people will be aware, somebody who gets sentenced to 10 years for manslaughter, they will come out of prison usually after 5, although the government have recently reduced that again, so they may come out after 4 years, but they will be on licence for the rest of that period. And as long as these violent offenders are on licence, they will be what's called MAPPA eligible and subject to everything to do with MAPPA. Grade 3 are for other dangerous offenders, and they are people who, because of intelligence known to mostly the police, but also other agencies about particular people. And if I can just give you an example, it may be somebody who's been previously violent, but is going down a particular path. So they may be going back into drug taking, where their behaviour is spiralling out of control, and it's quite obvious that they are posing a risk to somebody. Then agencies can step in, a decision can be made. Each area has got a MAPPA coordinator, and a MAPPA coordinator would make the decision that actually this person needs to be managed through MAPPA. Not because of something that they've done recently, but because of something they've done in the past, and it's obvious that they are posing a risk to the public. I will say that you cannot be MAPPA eligible if you have never been convicted of anything. You have to have been convicted in the past to some form of offence. And it doesn't have to be a violent offence, but you have to have a conviction. Legislation passed in 2022 shows how much faith is put in the whole system by the government, in that Category 4 MAPPA is for terrorist offenders. And anybody convicted of terrorist or domestic extremism can be and will be managed through MAPPA now. These are potentially people who can cause absolute devastation and are driven through beliefs. And the government has recognised that what needs to be done is for agencies to know about these people. Now, I'm not as naive as to think that MI5 or MI6 or whoever are watching these highly dangerous people will share all their information about them. We know that won't happen, but they do attend the MAPPA meetings and they do share some form of information, and what they do is take information back.
Am I correct in saying you can't really prove statistically that you made a difference?
Between 2010 and 2013, I was the National Police lead for MAPPA, I was seconded from Cumbria Constabulary to the Ministry of Justice. At that time, what the Ministry of Justice were striving to do was to come up with a statistic that showed MAPPA was successful. It's very difficult to prove a negative. Although there may be no figures to show that, having worked practically, I have seen many cases of keeping people from offending and how it actually comes about.
Nevertheless, it makes sense to have a joined up strategy where people are talking to each other about those, I'm going to use the word, who are at risk of reoffending.
Yes.
Because of their histories. And we all know that many of these men have had extremely difficult upbringings, are very damaged, they're traumatized, they're often emotionally deprived, and so on and so forth. And it is really good that society is doing something about it at one level.
It absolutely. And maybe now's a time too long. Sort of go into numbers and what we're looking at. You quite rightly mentioned men there. 94% of MAPPA nominals are men. 6% or thereabouts are not. So female offending does happen, and it's important, I think, that we point that out. But the females are managed exactly the same way that male offenders are. An awful lot of children get involved now with technology and the internet. Children are being criminalized because of things that they do. Now, when I was a boy, you couldn't access pornography, and what we found was that children are accessing pornography at a ridiculously young age, and it is turning some children into offenders. It may be offending by sending images of themselves to other people. It may be offending by making contact with other children and persuading them to send images of themselves, which is something that even in Cumbria Constabulary we were dealing with on a daily basis. And the challenges of that for law enforcement agencies is incredible. How do you combat? And it's very difficult. But by speaking to agencies, you get a very good idea about what's happening in particular offenders' lives. Now, these youngsters, in my opinion, need a lot of support, albeit they have committed offences. And they do get the support through MAPPA, and children's services rely heavily on police informing them about what's going on, and they can assist the process hugely and give a lot of support to kids who need it. By doing that, they stop a lot of further offending. But a real challenge. Currently in England and Wales, there are nearly 94,000 people who are MAPPA eligible. When people are convicted and sent to prison for 2.5 years, they never come off the register, then it just keeps growing. It keeps growing and growing. You mentioned risk assessment a short time ago, Peter. How risk assessment is conducted, and I'll concentrate on sexual offenders because the system's better at risk assessing sex offenders. And in the year 2000, there was a system called Risk Matrix 2000, and that's an assessment system that takes people's history into account. And it's a very complicated process. It takes police and probation officers an awful long time to do it. And it was very black and white. So you would put all these, and it was like, have this person been convicted of a burglary? Because if they have been convicted of a burglary, then they're more likely to commit a sexual offence. Have they been convicted of a stranger attack? Because that makes them riskier if they have committed an offence against a stranger, somebody that they've never known before. And it had all these rules, and it took quite a long time to do it. But once you did it, it came out with, this person is very high risk, this person is high risk, this person is medium risk, and this person is low risk. What that used to do was the police took that and they would say, oh, very high risk, then we have to go and visit that person every 2 months or every month. Every month it used to be for very high risk, at least once a month. High risk, it would be less. Medium risk, it would be once every 6 months and once a year for somebody who's a low-risk sexual offender. But they realised that wasn't sustainable because the numbers were growing. They couldn't keep making the departments bigger. They hadn't the resources. The police had to come up with a better system, and they worked with the prison service, the probation service again, to come up with another assessment system. And they come up with a thing that is called ARMS, the Active Risk Management System. An offender manager will sit down with an offender and they will go through a huge, lengthy number of questions that they are trained to ask in the right way, and they come up with, they know if somebody needs to be prioritised as being particularly risky.
Could I interrupt you? How do they know that the offender is not lying?
That comes down to training. And I will go into polygraphy in a short while. Polygraphy is now a real thing in this country. They fill in this long list of questions and they come up with, yes, this person is high risk and needs to be prioritised. So it's less regimented, the system. It's not black and white. And the highly skilled detectives who do the management on the police side get a very good idea about how risky.
Presumably, regardless of the assessment process, you've still got a resource problem because you've got more and more people coming through every year.
I think you said 93,000 people at the moment nationally.
Yeah.
So on a local level, how does a meeting actually work? Who decides which people you're going to discuss?
Yeah.
Because you can't discuss them all.
No, you can't. Stewart, you're right to bring this up. And meetings aren't held for every single person. In Cumbria, so I'll stick to Cumbria, but it's representative of the whole country. We have 900 people who are eligible for MAPPA management. These people are put into levels. Level 1 is a management level that doesn't involve multi-agency meetings. What it does involve is the sharing of information between all the agencies that have been mentioned before. But because these people, sex offenders, the lead agency is the police, and they will then, if everything's fine, if there's no worries, they won't insist on having a meeting. It's when somebody is acting in a way that raises their risk that the police would put a referral in to the MAPPA coordinator. The MAPPA coordinator would have a very small panel of people that he contacts or she contacts and say, the police have said this about such, and just call a person Bob. Yeah, Bob has been acting in a uncharacteristic way. We're very concerned about him, and we think that we should have a multi-agency meeting to discuss what is known about Bob.
So the whole thing is working on red flags.
It is very much.
Someone, an A&E doctor sees someone who's coming at a lot. It's well known. And he thinks, I mean, he flags it up to the coordinator, and the coordinator makes a decision about who you're going to talk about.
Yes. And there's a small percentage of the 900 in Cumbria that would be subject of meetings. Just because they're subject of meetings at a particular time doesn't mean that they will be for a long period of time. If their risk level reduces, then they will be back down to a level 1 where they'll be managed by the lead agency only. But at the meetings, if I could just impress upon the listeners how important these meetings are. So take it that somebody's risk level has risen, and there'll be a number of factors. So it may be that they've been reoffending. It may be that they've been violent at home. It may be that their alcohol abuse is getting out of hand. It may be that their drug taking is getting out of hand. It may be that their accommodation has fallen through and they've nowhere to live, which puts their risk level. But it's been decided that they will be discussed at an interagency meeting. The meetings have all the agencies plus more that I've spoken about. There will be a chair of the meeting, and they will discuss every single concern that the lead agency has, but also they will find out every single thing that other agencies hold about that particular people. If I take housing association, for instance, the information that is held by members of the housing, and because they all get MAPPA training, the people that are involved in that get MAPPA training, they know how important it is to record things down. And everybody's got systems they record things on. But just the fact that somebody at number 14 says to the housing officer, the person at 11 across the road, there's an awful lot of children going in there, in and out. Highly important. And most of these housing officers know, oh, I've got to record that. And I've got to talk about that if there's a MAPPA meeting. So I will record that. So that information, for instance, is hugely important.
Is there anything you specifically would want the listeners to know about that you haven't told us so far?
Yeah,
headlines.
I think the main thing is that they are managed. I find sexual offenders and violent offenders are managed in the community in a extremely diligent way, that the system genuinely works. What I would also like to impress to any listener who have got children or grandchildren is the importance of parenting the internet. I find it absolutely tragic that small children can be taken in by predatory sex offenders. I remember, I am retired now, but it's not that long ago that I had a mother who came and demanded to know what I was going to do about a Venezuelan who had made contact with her 7-year-old daughter and effectively got her to take her clothes off in front of the camp.
There was that case recently, the chap in Northern Ireland.
Yes, indeed.
Who was convicted.
That's right, that is convicted. But it is so important to keep children safe. And online, it's very easy for parents sitting downstairs to think because the child's in the bedroom, they're absolutely fine. They're not. And parenting that is very...
On that note, Stewart, do you have any final comments?
No, I'm impressed, Roy, that you feel the system's successful. And I'm just sitting here thinking it's a damn sight better, isn't it, than convicting someone, they go to prison, they come out and they're lost. It's this way that you're monitoring someone and presumably preventing.
Absolutely. And I would really like to impress upon people that it's not a case of trying to lock offenders up. Rehabilitation is right at the heart of the MAPPA process. We want people to not commit offences for themselves as much as potential victims. And it's highly important to try your very best to get people in a position where their life is better and they're non-offending people.
I think our listeners will be very grateful to you, Roy, for giving up your time. A lot of people have heard of MAPPA, but they wouldn't know about the details. Big thank you from me.
Thank you from me.
You're extremely welcome. Thank you very much.